So, welcome everybody to the second in our lecture series on technology-empowered conservation. Those of you who were here last week, I think you'll agree we had an absolutely amazing lecture by Alex Rogers, who really sort of showed to us how he was assembling some very old technology. In fact, those massive buckets sort of run off ships with very modern technologies of the Triton submarine platform, video, the Octopus infrastructure, and also video streaming, which is where it's going to lead in a little bit today. But I'm sure you all took different things away from that lecture. Just three of the things which really stuck in my mind from it, and there was many things. One was how, maybe because of the pressures on the marine oceans, how Alex's team had brought down the time from collecting data to the publication of a scientific output, how that science production time, he got it down to 18 months, which I thought was truly impressive when I consider how long it seems to me to take, writing a simple paper or whatever. Another thing which actually we were talking about in the BCM class just before we came here was this role of the super rich yacht owners in the whole system of that science. And then also, and this was the bit actually which I woke up worrying about, was the renewables conundrum, which he touched on and talking about. This worry that the technological solutions to climate change, renewables, creating demands for minerals, and that sort of pushing mining into the sea, and may even damage an older, slower Earth system. So I think there was lots of really fascinating stuff which came out of it, and I think this today's seminar is going to be equally exciting. And we're going to continue the theme of oceans. We're also going to pick up, I think, on that theme of the new challenges or the new data streams which are coming in a lot through video camera technology, and then the challenges of analysing those, and the real rapid rise of machine learning and AI in this sort of assembly of repertoires of doing biodiversity science. We've got a fantastic team who are going to talk to us today, who I'd like to introduce. First of all, Peter Kohler, who's the founder of the Plastic Tide project. You're just telling me you're a local government officer as well, which I hadn't quite clocked from your profile. But Peter, as you'll soon gather, I think as you know, he's got a passion for the oceans, just like many people here. He had his first degree in geographic information systems, and he's a trustee of the Scientific Exploration Society. And I think, Peter, you're the person really driving and leading this project. And then also with us is Dirk Gorissen, and Dirk is a senior engineer with Oxbotica, and he's the guy who is developing the algorithms to help us have driverless cars. Well, actually, he told me they're already working, and it's all sorted. But as you can imagine, of all of the big machine learning challenges, developing algorithms of that complexity is really pretty amazing. But also, Dirk, you've had a long interest in conservation applications, environmental applications, done a really cool project on using machine learning algorithms to identify orangutan nests. Is that right? From
tracking orangutans.
Tracking orangutans. Oh, okay. I thought it was the orangutan that's going on. Yeah. And really exemplifies perhaps one of the exciting new developments in conservation, this sort of coming together of people from all different walks of life who have that interest, and that different skill sets, who have that interest in solving problems. And then last but not least, who we've just met, is Ellie MacKay, who will be joining us via Skype. Ellie's an award-winning documentary filmmaker. There she is. Great up there. Welcome over Skype. And again, has a passion for oceans, but she's also a super amazing drone pilot and part of this project. She studied geographical science and evolutionary biology, I think, at Cambridge, and also did her MSc in communication science from Imperial. So with that technique, it's time for me to get out of the way and welcome. Thanks ever so much. Thanks everyone and welcome, and thanks for the awesome introduction, Paul. So we're the Plastic Tide. As Paul said, I sort of lead and sort of help coordinate it all. I think what we'll do is we'll just start off how it started, then we'll talk a bit about the science, and then we'll hand over to our two experts as well. So this is where it started. In the South Pacific, which I happened to bump into a skipper of a boat. He was sailing around the South Pacific, and I joined him. I was very fortunate while traveling, and it was paradise. It was pure paradise. I mean, all those sort of fantasies you have about paradise and blue seas and all that sort of stuff. You know, we would weigh anchor, we'd drop in somewhere off an island somewhere, and I'd jump in and I'd see a leopard shark below me sleeping on a grass bed. You know, it was incredible. But one of the things, it's a paradise under siege, and I think you could see it, and lots of challenges around this sort of environment became obvious after spending a lot of time there sailing between islands. And one of the most visible ones was marine litter, plastic waste and other types of litter. I mean, it was everywhere. And you know, coming back from this, it just bothered me. You know, as Paul explained, I've got a degree in GIS. You know, I'm not a marine scientist or a marine litter expert. So I just came back, and this was 2008, and I just kept looking for ways I could do something, and how I could do it, and what I could do. And so I started researching the figures, and I've just pulled up these UN Environmental Programme infographics, which are really, I think, quite impactful. You know, minimum $8 billion US this plastic waste is costing us. That's one figure, and that is rapidly growing. And the next graph shows by 2050, if we do nothing, we're looking at 1,800 million tons of litter being produced. So it's a problem that is growing massively, and it has an impact, it has a cost. So you've all seen the popular statistics. By 2050, you know, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish, according to this World Economic Forum infographic. 20% of our oil will go purely on plastic production, and that's a diminishing resource that we don't have much of left. And then 15% of the global carbon budget share will be in plastic production and logistics. But then there's forewarning for those who might be squeamish. There's a big impact on marine life as well, and these are some of the images that have come to light in the last few years. You've got plastic ingestion, you've got plastic entanglement, you've got strangulation, you've got potential plastic poisoning happening, and all of that is growing, and we don't quite know how much is out there. We don't know what the impact is of it, and so with this big problem that I was researching and finding the amount of damage it does to our environment and the threat to marine life and indeed to our own life. You know, there are stats now that say the average European seafood consumer consumes around 11,000 pieces of microplastic a year that they don't know about. And the science there's not enough science yet to say there's a proven concept for the impact on humans, but certainly on a chemical level, some of the additives and the colorings to plastics that can leach out have been known to cause alterations to behaviors and hormonal balances. And certainly with certain species of fish, there was a paper on it. There's certain species of fish with in environmentally relevant concentrations, they found that it altered the larvae behavior, and so the fish didn't swim away from predators as much, which could then mean that more predators eat that fish, which means that the plastics get concentrated even more than would naturally be otherwise. So
this is an infograph of how the interaction between the economy and the environment is plastic. So as you can see, it's really complicated. There's lots of different stakeholders, lots of different people. It's very much like climate change in the sense that there is no silver bullet. And when you look into it, you very quickly realize that fact. But there was one stat that stood out the most when going through all this research. And it was actually by a paper from one of our science advisors, Dr. Eric van Sibbel. And that's 99% of the plastic in our ocean is missing. Once it enters our ocean, we don't know where it goes. We don't know what types are most common or most prevalent. We don't know if there are hotspots in certain places. We don't know if it sinks to the bottom of the ocean. We believe, I think, sort of anecdotally, they think that a lot of the concentrations on the seabed and on the coastal regions. So there's the two sinks that we think, and the rest is in the water column, on the surface, which is the 1% that we do know, it's on the surface, or in the biota, so in the animals. And the various percentages of those we don't know. So, and here's another very powerful sentence that I think underlines the importance of knowing that as a start to tackling that problem. I mean, hopefully it doesn't get into the ocean in the first place, but in order to know how to prevent it getting into the ocean, we need to know what is in the ocean and how it's getting in there. And that, I think, is this sentence, is the significance of impacts of plastic pollution in the ocean. And then further research, you start finding that actually there's the figures are weak, and because of the variability and the cost of trying to survey large areas of beaches consistently across multiple countries globally to build up a consistent picture of plastic accumulation. And that's leading to underestimations of the amount of plastic, possibly by an order of magnitude in some places. And so, how do we then solve this? What can I do? What can we do? So, I had the idea that I wanted to travel beaches and survey the amount of plastics on the beach myself, but then this came up, and how could I make it quicker? And then I started to understand about drone technology, and I had a conversation with Dirk here about how initially I thought drones could pick up the litter. That would be a dream, but the complication in that, and Dirk maybe allude on that, but it's huge. And so what we can do is monitor the litter with plastic, monitor the litter with drones. And so that's how we formed the plastic tide. And our vision is to basically clean the ocean. That's the simple impact that we want to achieve. And how we do it is by using drone tech and machine learning to create a sustainable and scalable way to detect and map global marine litter. For scientists, everything we do, we produce open source as well. And this is the team. So the trustees, because we're a charity, are here with us tonight. So we've got Dirk and we've got Ellie. But then we also have science advisors and Dr. Stefan Lutzenegger, who's our machine learning and computer vision expert. So his lab is producing the algorithm. I've got Dr. Stefan Lutzenegger down there. That's actually Dr. Eric van Sibbel down here. That's my bad. So he's interested in looking at ocean flows and prediction of plastics, and Dr. Kaylee Wiles is looking at the environmental psychology and impact of it, and Dr. Arturo Castillo is looking at the cycles of plastic and the circular economy, and when we find the plastic, what can that benefit us with? Once we find where the plastic is, what then? And he's looking at policies around that. So then we start to use the drones. This is where we set up an exercise to collect data all around the UK, and basically we scan the beach with a drone. We upload the images to a citizen science portal where people tag and classify, and then we can then extract that to then train the machine learning algorithm to find plastics by itself. And what I'll do now is I'll hand over to Ellie MacKay, who's our drone pilot, and tech expert and a STEM advocate, and she will explain a bit more about the detail and the method about how we achieved it. So over to you, Ellie. Can you hear us? Okay. All right. So over to you, Ellie.
Okay, so hi everybody, thank you so much for inviting me out. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I've got another meeting to get to straight after this, so sorry for the sort of sound delay, and thank you for your patience. I can't actually see the slides, so Pete is going to do like his magic and keep up with me on the slide. So just do bear with me on that. So if we're going to be on the first slide.
Yeah.
Thanks. So basically when I met Pete, he had this idea of using drones to scan the beaches, and we sort of had to essentially turn that into reality. So we had to go from the traditional method of lots of wonderful volunteers who currently work around the UK. Sort of every weekend they go out and they tag very diligently, make a note with a clipboard and a pen and paper, and they write down what they find. And that's fantastic, and we're not criticising that at all, but it needed to be scaled up massively, and that's where the drones came in. So we wanted to go from that model to a much more futuristic model, which is using drones themselves to scan the beaches. There's several reasons for doing that. Obviously, firstly, it's much faster because the drone can scan a huge area of beach in just a matter of minutes. In 10-15 minutes, you can scan the entire beach. And that's using the very basic drones as well. We're not talking yet about fixed-wing drones or military-style drones, which have much longer battery power and that sort of thing. So anybody with off-the-shelf drone and a license would be able to come down to the beach and perform this scan much more quickly than the several hours it takes these poor frozen volunteers with their freezing cold hands to pick up individual pieces. The other reason we wanted to use drones for scanning is that it's much more scientifically robust. So using the same drone and the same scanning for every single beach means that all of the data that we collect is repeatable, it's comparable, it's reliable, it's accurate, all the sort of scientific terminology that you need, which means that data is irrefutable when you take it to government, when you take it to policymakers, when you take it to the brands like Kohler and present them with data. They can't say, oh, well, that's subjective, that's that Brenda on a Sunday picking up Coca-Cola bottles, she's seen an increase, but I don't know that scientifically happened. So what we're creating is a massive database of robust data. So we started with a trip around the UK. So Pete, on the next slide, should have a map in it.
Yeah, done.
Yeah, thank you. So we not quite on the back of a napkin, but drew up on the back of a sand dune our route that we're going to take around the UK, and we did 4,200 miles around British Isle, and we surveyed 30 just over 30 beaches. And the reason we did that was firstly to gain a very quick snapshot of the quality of beaches, beach cleanliness around the UK from all different coastlines. Secondly, because we needed to collect data from a range of different substrates. So we wanted to see what the imagery of the drone would look like on sand, on rocks, on seaweed, on sort of mulchy, mangrovey, estuary type footing, on all sorts of different pebbles and stones, that sort of thing. So we wanted a range of different types of beach. We also needed a range of topography, so some steep beaches, big, high, sandy beaches, some cliffy beaches that had more longshore drift or less longshore drift, all these sorts of things. So there's quite a scientific approach into selecting the beaches. But then there were also social selection criteria as well. So we wanted to choose beaches, obviously, that were accessible because we were encouraging volunteers to come down, and perhaps quite close to a nearby town or city, so that we could look at the impacts of litter from tourism, from the local land use. And then thirdly, and perhaps unfortunately most important one, was to do with permissions. So the Crown Estate owns a certain portion of the beach between the strand lines, and then also certain people like the National Trust own some of the beaches, and some of them are privately owned. So although we had our selection of our favourite beaches that we really wanted from a scientific point of view, we were then reliant on the ones that we could get permission for. So in the very early stages, this was one of the biggest problems, and it was months and months of emails and paperwork and risk assessments and trying to prove what we were doing, and we're not just maniacs trying to fly a drone around, but that we did have sort of scientific validity. And thankfully now that we're becoming more well recognised, permissions are easier to obtain. I'm a qualified drone pilot, and I've got an extensive licence, and I also have permissions to fly in National Trust land, to fly in restricted zones and that sort of thing, so that opened the way a bit. So we selected those beaches, and then next slide, please, Keith.
Okay. Yeah, it's on the next one.
So we then set off on our journey, and on every beach we arrived and we did an aerial scan of the beach with the drone, and then we invited volunteers to come down and clean up the beach, because it's only really morally right to clean the beach that you've just scanned. We couldn't go all over the country looking for plastic and leave it there. So we coordinated with local beach volunteers, people like Surfers in Sewage, the hashtag 2-Minute Beach Clean, local representatives, and lots of local sort of beach clean volunteer group as well from Facebook and social media mostly. So they would come down and join us on each beach and do the cleanup, and we'd photograph and tag anything unusual or any brands and that sort of thing. So we were still doing this traditional clean and tagging, but we were complementing it with random surveys. So the way that it worked, and I think we've got a slide coming up with a bit more detail, but the way that it worked was to scan a grid pattern, essentially. You can also find it on our website as well, because all of this data is open source, and the methodology is open source as well. So the plan was to make it a very, very simple survey, which means that anybody with a drone pilot can head out for the weekend and volunteer, one weekend a month or something to come scan the local beach. We also selected a shelter. We could have done this with really high-tech drone technology, and it is possible, and we may be doing it in the future, but wanted this to be something that was accessible and something that anybody with a drone of a high street sort of model would be able to do. So we flew a Phantom 3 Pro and a Phantom 4, which are standard available. It's quite cheap now, the price is coming down. We fly those very straightforward in a sort of 100 metre by 10 metre grid, and flies up and down, so that there's a certain overlap, and I'm sure Dirk will tell you more with the algorithm about the importance of that overlap. So the photograph were overlapping, and the photographs were taking over 3 seconds per metre, depending on how tuned, so that we gathered about 500 to 1,000 images per beach. We originally were flying using an automated grid pattern, so from these apps that you can get where you can pull the pattern on the drone, on the iPhone or the iPad. You can draw what pattern you want to fly, press go, and then the drone takes off, flies the pattern, comes back and lands. Fantastic. Hypothetically, that's brilliant. In reality, we had a few problems with that. Number one, because I don't know, Pete, if I should be admitting this, the first time we tried it, the drone tried to commit suicide and fly directly into the ocean.
Yeah, that was quite sad.
That was our first day, and we were super excited, and then it was all very nearly over. So obviously there are bugs in that system, which is why you have to have a qualified drone pilot who is able to switch to manual and recover that quickly. Secondly, because the accuracy of it is actually not as good as manual flight. Because of things like wind, the offshore winds will push the drone and cause drift. Trying to fly the drone, and Pete knows this because he gave it a go, trying to fly the drone in strong wind is a bit like, when you get a supermarket trolley with a wonky wheel and you push in a straight line down the aisle. If it's fully loaded at going at high speed, you have to kind of push it at a weird angle to keep it straight. That's sort of what flying a drone is like in high wind. So sometimes the automated grid system wouldn't cope with that. It'd be off towards a cliff, or it would be down all over the place, and we get very wobbly routes being climbed. So after the first few attempts, we ended up switching to manual mode, where I would just fly the thing manually, which gave me a lot more control, and it meant that our grid was, sort of much more accurate. And obviously, as drone technology improves, and that wind resistance and so on, and the gyroscope in the drone improve, then eventually we will be able to switch back to that model, so anyone can press play and good. And already the newer models are better at applying those grids in high winds, so that's good. The third reason why we do manually as well was because it obviously changes depending on the topography of the beach. And sometimes the automated system would just sort of fly at a standard height, which means as the beach undulates, you're getting a variation of resolution because the camera is at a different height from the beach. So flying it manually allowed us to fly more consistently, but also lower as well, because the automated programs have got a minimum height for safety. They're only allowed to fly about 10 meters, they can't fly lower than that. Whereas if you switch up to manual mode and I'm in control, I can fly much lower, so I was able to get much better, basically much bigger imagery. So that was just, this is all sort of the prototype, this was trials, and these were the kind of things that we learned along the way. So, next slide, please. Is this the car? Is this Lucy?
Now it's on Lucy.
So we had some emotional days. We had some emotional moments. Taking Lucy to the Highlands. She did very, very well doing all that long driving. Lucy is my car, by the way. I should probably have explained that. Trusty little 4x4 from the beaches. Next slide, please. We had some very, very cold days, and there were some days where we were on remote beaches that were filthy and plastic, and it was just the two of us because it was pouring with rain and no volunteers showed up. It was minus whatever degrees, and it was pretty tough, but all the more reason to try and make this program work so that the volunteers don't have to go out in those conditions. Next slide, please. Ultimately we had a lot of great days. This is our final beach theme, which was finishing off at the very end. We did get a lot of volunteers come down, and their passion for their local beach and their pride and ownership over their local beaches is something that we really want to harness and tap into. And if we can get local sort of drone pilot volunteer in each region, they can become a guardian for their beach. So we built up some amazing connections. Had a fantastic time getting to know all the local kind of advocates and Ocean guardians too. So, see the next slide, please.
So, future applications one?
No, Zooniverse, please.
Oh yeah, okay.
You got it?
Yep.
Yep, Zooniverse. Rating vision from the skies.
Yep. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I can't see. So, what do we then do with that data? So the reason we did this big long journey and gathered all these photographs in all these harsh conditions was to train the algorithm, which I'll tell you more about. But we needed to provide baseline data to teach it how to recognize plastics on those different substrates. So we took the drone imagery and we loaded it into a program called Zooniverse. Hands up, who's heard of Zooniverse?
Like almost everyone.
Cool. So if you haven't, go check it out. Zooniverse is an amazing online citizen science sort of crowdsourced platform where these massive science projects can upload loads of data and tag for fun and sort of gamifies it, get school children involved, you can have competitions. And we used the Zooniverse platform we partnered with to host all of our imagery. So they took our images, they divided them down into even smaller images, so we had even more. And each of those images goes into Zooniverse, and you can log into Zooniverse and you get this screen which shows the photograph, and you can click and draw a box around it. I'm not sure how clearly you can see the slide, but you can draw a little green box and tag, and it will come up with options. It will say, is this a bottle cap? Is this a straw? Is it a plastic fragment? Is this medical waste or hygiene? And you can tag exactly what it is, and then click next. And it's actually really addictive, and I recommend something you try it, because you get really into it. And so we released all of our images on there, and we programmed that so that each photograph needs to be tagged with the same box and the same description 15 times before it's retired from these images. So 15 separate individual people all have to corroborate to say this here is a bottle cap. And then to be fairly certain that it's probably a bottle cap if 15 strangers all over the world have all tagged it the same. So that's quite a high level of repeat results as well. Normally, sometimes we do between 8 and 10. We set it at 15 just to make sort of sure that the data is up. And that information then feeds into the algorithm, which I won't say more about, Dirk will tell you about how that actually works. Very, very cool system where it then takes all that information to learn what is not a bottle cap or a piece of plastic fragment or whatever. And so ultimately that's the sort of end result from our prototype, our initial trial, where we went all around the UK, we took that information, put it through Zooniverse, and that information was tagged by people all over the world, and that data then fed into the algorithm. So next slide, please. Future applications?
Yep.
So these are not, I need to tell you now, these are not from the plastic type. We're not at this stage yet. These are just, like stock images of what we eventually want to build up. So the plan is to build a global map of all the plastic hotspots, and that is using data that is from all over the world. The algorithm has built-in codes that the data is automatically loaded to our system, goes on to Zooniverse and tag set. So eventually we're going to have a map similar to this, where you can zoom in and you can see individual hotspots which are affected, and this essentially is endability. So just to throw a few out for you, just to finish off. Obviously, just finding out where the plastic is key, because how do we know how to clean it up compared to stuff we don't know where it is? So trying to find some of that missing 99% is really critical. Looking at temporal changes as well is really useful, because we've just done one scan of all of those beaches around the UK, but we don't know how that's different in April than August, or how it changes from 2015 to 2016 to 2025. So if we were to do this monthly or annually or however regularly, we would build a map of temporal change. That will tell us which area is getting worse, which area is getting better. It would also tell us how the plastic is moving around the coastlines, whether it's coming down the Irish coast, for example, whether things from the north are heading up or down, all that sort of thing. It will also tell us which beaches are more affected, for example, by storms. And if we can say these 5 beaches are the worst targets after storms, you get huge storm surge and all this plastic wash up, then local councils can direct their beach clean efforts, their recycling schemes, their local volunteers, their paid council workers to those areas at those times. If we know which areas are worst affected by seasonal tourism, we can make sure that we have provision. In the UK, we do have the provision. We've got the money, we've got the recycling systems, we've got the infrastructure, we've got the transport network to clean up these beaches. So we don't have the excuses that Indonesia or India or pretty much anywhere else in the world has less economically developed countries that don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. We do. So if we can pinpoint where to go, we can effectively distribute our resources. And eventually, we can also zoom in on this map and target particular brands. For example, Coca-Cola, we're looking at you. We can sort of build up a crime map of where the Coke bottles are in the cup. For any other brand, many plastic brands are available. So that's the sort of end goal. Just final slide, please. Impact?
Yep.
So just to summarise, we cleaned over 30 beaches, we've had over 80 volunteers come down, we managed to pick up over a tonne of litter, and actually I want to highlight that because the tonne is, it's a lot, but some people might not think it's that much for the whole of the UK beaches, but bear in mind that most of the polystyrene, which weighs nothing, or thin food packaging, Cadbury's wrapper, weighs nothing. You can imagine how much volume a tonne of litter is. We accepted 12,000 drone images. I'm not sure what the current figure is. Pete, I don't know if you can fill us in. It's significantly
approaching 15,000 now, I think.
15,000 now. And we were amazed that Zooniverse program took off. We were hoping to get people involved, get people tagging, and we couldn't believe how many volunteers. We've got over 10,000 volunteers all around the world, all ages, all backgrounds. And they were tagging day and night. Some volunteers were tagging amazingly, just got obsessed with it. And we had 1.4 million tags in the first couple of months. And again, we just update with essentially 2 million now.
Yeah, I think we're approaching that sort of level now. Yeah.
Which is just astonishing, and it shows you how much demand there is out there for people. The messages we were getting from Zooniverse every day. I had no idea the beach was 30. I don't recognise what beach this is from. Are you sure this is in the UK? All these photos we're getting. And people got really into it because I think it tapped into and engaged something in people where they wanted to do something about it. A lot more people volunteer for beach clean now as a result of getting involved in flagging. And just finally, we recently partnered with British Science Week, so you'll see more of us in March, where we're featuring quite heavily in their programme. And we're linking with local schools. Pete will tell you more about our future kind of partnerships and applications, but that is an overview of what we did and how we're being actively held with them. And I believe Dirk is going to speak next about more details about the algorithm itself.
Yeah, thank you, Ellie. Dirk, do you want to? So, Dirk Gorissen's already had an introduction, but he's a machine learning expert, runaway academic, I think you described.
Yeah, runaway academic is probably. And I saw that I put a question mark behind the expert because the field is there's so much going on. There's always something new. Expert is a dangerous word. Yeah, so I think I used to work in the drone industry, and I think that's how we met at some point. But I've always had an interest in kind of, to my own background, in the intersection between technology on one hand and kind of humanitarian conservation domains on the other hand, and kind of that interface where I always like to be. So I've done lots of different things. I started to get involved as a digital humanitarian and crisis response and civic mapping and that kind of thing. Then I spent a lot of time working in Tanzania around rural water supply and data management around that and mapping water points and maintaining of water points and things. Now, main project I'm working on is, as mentioned, orangutan tracking. So this is for an animal conservation organization. But I was trying to kind of bring technology and into humanitarian or a conservation domain. That being said, I'm very actually, for a guy who comes from the technology side, I'm very skeptical about technology. I get very annoyed that lots of people wave the flag and think, oh, technology is going to solve everything. It's not. These things are complicated. Like I was giving a talk about the orangutan stuff, and the conference organizer made a big headlines. It was like drones saving orangutans from extinction. That kind of stuff just makes me cringe because. Yeah. So all of these things, it's a big problem. So like plastic waste, I mean, Peter and Ellie went through it wonderfully. These are big, complicated problems. There's lots of different factors. Yes, machine learning and deep learning is great and sexy. It's fun. It's new, but it's not going to solve the fundamental problem. But it can be a useful tool. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So day job, I work at Oxbotica, very quickly, we're a spin out from the Oxford Robotics Lab, and we do mobile autonomy, so the algorithms that make cars or forklifts or trucks or things go autonomous, and it's all the software underneath that. If that's something people are interested in, talk to me. And kind of related to that, I always had an interest in litter, like a personal pet project is, I'd really like to build a robot that can clean up litter, but that's a separate conversation and a big problem. Anyway, so let's start really simple. So first of all, who's used machine learning before? Is part of their research or work? Anyway. Okay, 1 or 2. Cool, okay, that's good, because I wasn't sure how to pitch this. I'm just staying very high level and intuitive, and also conscious of time. So anyway, let's start simple. So this is a cat. This is a damn Oxford, mine. This is a carrot, very good. This is a Cookie Monster. Nobody saw that. Okay. That was easy, right? Right? And I could ask, 1-year-old, maybe even 2-year-old, probably even a 1-year-old, and they'd be able to figure this out. You show them a picture of a cat, yeah, cat. Show a picture of a dog, yeah, dog. Easy, right? Now, actually, it's not until, let's say, 5 or 6 years ago that we've really been able to solve this with a computer. This exact problem. And why? Because, humans, we see this, and we've been hardwired through, millions of years of evolution to be able to take in a scene like that, and we can segment it. We can figure out what the colors are. We can figure out what the foreground and the background is, what the grass is, where the dog starts and ends, etc. It's such a natural thing for us. It's so effortless. But the thing is, when for example, when you're doing this on a driverless car, what we see, we don't see this as a computer. If you're programming this, you see this. You just see a bunch of numbers. So based on this bunch of numbers, you have to figure out, okay, what am I looking at? And again, in the driverless car scenario, it's like, is this a car parked in front of me? Is this a car coming straight at me? Is this a granny crossing the road? It's just some numbers. And where the numbers come from, so numbers are just pixel values. So you got a photograph, and every dot in the photograph is a pixel, and that just has a number associated. Think of it as a color code. So 0 is black, and 255 is white. And you've got the colors in between at a high level. So that's actually quite a tricky problem. But as humans, we're just hardwired to solve this really easily. But actually, for computers, it's pretty hard. So, and this is where machine learning comes in: is how do you train a machine or an algorithm to detect stuff based on image. So what we want to do in the case of Plastic Tide is we have an image like this. So this is one of Ellie's drone images, and there's a bit of plastic. I think it's fishing wire or something. And you want a box around it. So that's what you want to do automatically. That's currently what people do. If you go to Zooniverse.com, you log in and you draw boxes. And that's the whole reason Zooniverse exists, is because we have a few million years of evolution up here, and we can easily draw those boxes. It's easy for us, but it's actually hard for a computer to do. If we could solve the problem on the computing side, then we wouldn't need Zooniverse. We could do it automatically. But that's still a way away. So again, we want to draw that box, but all we have is a series of numbers. And note that, if suddenly, so this is in sunlight, if now, there was a cloud coming from the sun, and there'd be a shadow there, all the numbers would change. So, okay, so in terms of intuition, so machine learning. So let's stick with the cats and the dogs, right? So we've just seen, a photograph is just essentially a series of numbers. It's just a matrix where every color is a number. And you can imagine a single photograph is just a long list of numbers. You can see that as a single point in some kind of high dimensional space, right? Well, let's ignore the high dimensions because that gets confusing. But let's think of this just in two dimensions. So here, every photograph is a point, and you can imagine I've got a cluster of points for cats and a cluster of points for dogs, and you can see that they're two very separate things. And I want to have an algorithm that can detect the difference between the two, which means I essentially want to learn what this boundary is between the two classes, which, in this case, is just a linear function, right? So in terms of intuition, a photograph is just a number, essentially. Okay, it's a high-dimensional number, but let's ignore that for now. It's just a point in space. And every photograph is a different point. So if I were to take all the points for cats and all the points for dogs, hopefully it looks something like that, where I got two clusters, and then all I have to do is somehow find the line or the hyperplane that separates the two classes. That's kind of at an intuitive level what machine learning is trying to do. So you take your input data, you present it in some numerical space, and you're trying to learn a model that's going to separate your different classes, in this case cats and dogs, but it could be a malignant tumor versus a normal tumor. Or again, to help with the intuition, so let's make this concrete. So again, I got my pictures of cats and dogs, and instead of trying to think in terms of these pixel values, let's just pick two features and try to separate these things out. So one feature is fluffiness, and the other feature is lightness of coat. So let's say those are the pictures I have, and so you see, so cats are typically very fluffy, so they'll tend to be here at this end of the scale, where dogs are not so fluffy. And in this case, given the pictures I have, that's my knowledge about cats and dogs, that cats always tend to have a light coat, so they're up in the top, and dogs tend to have a dark coat, so they're down the bottom. So using those two variables, I can plot them out, and I can put my pictures in two different regions, and you can see you can find that separating boundary pretty easily. So that's kind of what you're trying to do. But of course, it isn't always that easy. So again, going back to the points example, what if you have something like this? So in here, you've got two classes, distinct, but how would you can't just separate them into, you can't just find a linear function that can separate them. So okay, you can try to use a nonlinear function, but these things get complicated. Or, going the cat and dog example, what if you have a dog that looks like that? Right? Then suddenly, is it the cat? No, it's the dog, but I can't draw my straight line anymore. So, and there's different ways around that. And typically what helps is, well, you could go for more complicated models, or you could try to add more features. So for example, in the points example, if we add a third dimension, a third feature, suddenly that third feature does enable us to separate the two classes, and then we can find a linear decision boundary. Or so in terms of cats and dogs, again, it's maybe a bit hard to see, but if I have all my cats and dogs on the flat plane, so let's say fluffiness and what was the other one? Whiteness of coat. But then let's say I add another dimension, which is say length of tail, for example. And then actually, that even though the dog, this dog might be, okay, maybe length of tail is a bad example. Length of the tongue, there we go. So even though we say, well, actually, okay, it is white, it is fluffy, but it's not a cat. But actually, if we measure the length of the tongue, okay, yeah, then it's a dog. So that's a third feature. And that, again, allows me to separate them into two classes. And this is traditionally how people have solved this kind of computer vision problem. People have looked at the data they have in front of them, be it cats and dogs or tumors or whatever, but especially in a self-driving context. And people have just thought about what are good features, fluffiness, color of the coat, and length of the tail, and whatever. And people just come up with these things, and you can construct these models that allow you to have an algorithm that can separate between the two. But very quickly this gets complicated. Again, I could come up with another picture of a dog which doesn't have, has a shorter tongue, and then again you're like, okay, I need to find something else. So this gets complicated. And this is how people try to approach this cat versus dog problem. You're trying to reason about what the world looks, and you're trying to come up with features. Okay, how pointy are the ears? But again, even just the color of the coat. The dog suddenly goes under the shadow and under a tree, and there's a shadow, and all the numbers change, and your rules don't quite work anymore. And so this is where machine learning comes in. And this is the idea. Instead of trying to come up with features, you just give lots and lots of examples to a learning algorithm, and you let it figure out what the features are. And most popular these days, we're going through a real hype at the moment, a neural network. So anybody heard of deep learning? Yes, okay, so it is kind of, okay, so neural networks are interesting. They've gone through various hype cycles. When I started, so wait, I think they reached another peak in the 80s and in the 90s or so. But then people realized, hang on, we can't even solve some really simple problems with these neural networks. They don't work. Oh yeah, and so neural networks, just to explain, they're kind of, we all have neurons in our head, very complicated things, lots of interconnected networks going on there. But you take that, you take a very, very abstract, simplified representation of the neurons in your head, and that gives you a mathematical model. But it's a very, very, very much simplified representation. But you can do it. And you have individual neurons which connect to each other. But so yeah, through the 90s this was a big thing, but then it turns out, well, actually we can't really solve anything interesting, so then, everybody gave up on them. I worked with them during my PhD. My supervisor at the time was saying, look, Dirk, what are you doing? This stuff doesn't work, don't waste your time. And this was the case until about 2004, where Geoffrey Hinton, a professor at University of Toronto, came up with a new way of training these things, and faster and more efficient. And computing hardware had caught up, and suddenly now they're everywhere. So if you look on your phone, the thing that's doing your speech recognition, or the face detection on Facebook, or whatever, all of that is using these neural networks. And so the idea is you have, every neuron has a set of inputs and a set of outputs. So sticking with so in this case it's face detection. So I've got an image of a face. So let's say this is 32 by 32 pixels. So that's a matrix of numbers again. Every pixel goes to an input, and that input, so here there's a very simple nonlinearity here. You push that input through a simple function, so that input gets transformed, and this transformed input gets transformed again and again and again, and you feed your image through the network, and at every layer it'll get transformed, and then you get an output. So in the beginning I give this an image, or let's say stick with a cat. So I have a picture of a cat, I put it through my network, it'll propagate through, and at the output I have two outputs which are either cat or dog, 1 or 0. And so I give it an image, and the very first cat I show it, the network will just randomly say dog. What you say, and then it's up to the human to say, no, that's actually wrong, this is a cat. As you say, and that's an error. you can give the network. You made a mistake. And then you have that error, which you can propagate back. So you can use the error to update your little models in the network. And essentially what you're doing is gradient descent. But again, I don't want to go too deep, but the whole, it's all around supervised training. So you have a model, you have lots of pictures, you know what the pictures are, and you just give it examples. And initially the network just gets all of them wrong. But the more you give, or examples you give, and the more you tell them, okay, this is wrong, that's right, this is right, the model will update its parameters and slowly converge on something that's correct. Now, actually, it's not intuitive that would actually work, but it does, and it works extremely well. And what's interesting that the model will automatically do is it will build feature detectors. So like the cat and dog where I was saying, okay, let's pick fluffiness and let's pick length of the tongue or whatever, that's something we come up with. But what turns out, if you have one of these models and you just give it lots and lots and lots of examples, and you just give it and you just correct its mistakes, and then you start looking, okay, you pick one individual neuron and you say, what has this thing actually learned? What is this detecting? And if you do this for faces, you'll find that if you look at the neurons here early on, essentially what they're doing is edge detection. They're activating or where you have edges, so boundaries between light and dark. As you go further up the network, so in terms of faces, you start seeing neurons that are detecting parts of a face. So maybe this neuron will be for detecting eyes, that one will detect a mouth, that one will detect a nose. When you go further up the network, suddenly these guys will be they'll be triggering for whole faces or parts of a face. So you get this hierarchy of features. The lower part of the network will detect the low-level things, and as you go up the network, you get more semantically meaningful features. And that is learned completely automatically. Nobody told it that we need an eye detector and a nose detector and a mouth detector, and then you need to put them together. It kind of makes sense. That's maybe a good way of doing it. But the network learns this automatically. And that's kind of a big reason why these things became so popular. The key thing is you just have to give it enough data. So that's kind of neural networks in general. But there's lots of variations here. You can have neural networks with feedback loops that learn through time. You've got lots of different architectures. Because in this case, we got 1, 2, 3 layers, 3 hidden layers that they call it. That's actually pretty small. These days you can have go up to 100 or 200 layers, and they can have all kinds of weird interconnections in between them. And there's lots of tricks and things to make these things more powerful. But that's more of an art than a science. Anyway, so these things are a big thing at the moment. And then you can tune the architecture specifically for looking at images. Maybe, and probably I don't want to go into this too detail, but if you look at how the human cortex processes images, there's a series of stages where, actually, this is going to go too deep. Actually, never mind about this. But the key idea here is, instead of trying to come up with rules, how you're going to classify something as a dog or a cat, you're going to just say, I'm going to have lots of examples, they're labeled, and I just push them through the network, and whenever the network makes a mistake, I know there's an error, and I can use that error to improve my model. That's essentially it. And you just turn the handle again and again and again and again. And actually people tried this in the 90s, but the computers weren't fast enough, so nothing worked. Now we just got more memory and faster computers, and now everything suddenly works. Right, so, and you can do different things with these. So you can either do just pure classification, is what we were talking about, given a picture, is it a cat or a dog? You can do, if you have a classifier, you can kind of slide it over your image in kind of a sliding window way, and then you can get a bounding box. You see where is the cat exactly. Or you can try to solve the problem directly, and you're talking about object detection, so you've got a picture and you've got lots of different objects and you draw boxes around them individually. Or I guess the most complicated is when you want to label every single pixel. So you want to label every pixel as either being grass or cat or duck or dog or etc. Again, now humans are extremely good at this. Computers are catching up, but still have a way to go. So that's kind of high-level overview of what we're doing with machine learning. But again, I'm talking mostly about neural networks. There are other models available, but again, for computer vision, these things have come to completely dominate everything. And in the case where you're trying to label objects, they're pretty much on par with human performance, and even better. The limitation is really how much patience does a human have to kind of label all the images to get like what the baseline is. So these things are very good. But interestingly also, then people get, some people get carried away. Oh my God, computers, they're smart and they're intelligent and they're going to take over the world and blah, blah, blah. There's some really interesting research as well where you can take a state-of-the-art cat detector. So this is a detector that will give you, 99.9% accuracy on any image of a cat you give it. And what you can do is you can change one pixel, a single pixel, so a single number, and it'll say it's a flamingo. You have to choose that pixel quite well, but you can fool them. And this is now sprouted a whole branch of machine learning looking at adversarial examples. So how can you fool these? Try to understand what has the model actually learned. And if it turns out you can fool the model that something is a flamingo when actually it's a cat by changing one single number, it's not probably that intelligent, because a human is not fooled by that. So that's really interesting, and that's still an area of work. Right. So what we did. So going back to the plastics, this is the problem we're trying to solve, right? We have a picture of the beach, and is there a bottle top or is there something else? We want to localize where the bit of plastic is on the beach. And so again, this is the problem of object detection. So kind of this is what we want to do with the plastics. So is it a shampoo bottle or is it a Coke can or whatever? And actually quite tricky. And there's different models floating around. The one that was settled on, and again, I have to give a lot of credits here to Stefan and Ben at Imperial for doing the legwork on this. So there's different models out there. The one that was chosen was YOLO. You only look once, and there's a whole background to why they name it is. But essentially, the way it works. So again, you have this network, and now actually here one of these blocks is, so for example here it says 7 by 7, which means you've got 49 of those neurons. 7 by 7, and then 1,024 deep. So you got 49 neurons, 1,000 layers deep. So this is actually, if you add them all, you've got big things. There are like 50 million parameters in this thing. So it's a big model. It takes quite a lot of time to train. And what you do is you take your image and you segment it into a grid, and then you make it, for every grid cell you make a prediction as to what you think the object is in that grid cell. And at the same time, you predict bounding boxes. Where do you think the bounding boxes are in the image? And then you take those two bits of information, they get fused together and give you a final prediction. And all of that happens kind of by cleverly manipulating those neurons there. Again, there's a whole paper if you want to go into details. There's different object detection algorithms. So YOLO is a popular one. It's useful. We actually use it on the cars as well because it's fast. It's quite accurate, but it's fast. You've also got things like fast RCNN and SSD, etc., which are somewhat more accurate, but they're slower. This is the whole thing in itself. But fundamentally, it's always the same thing. So you've got a network of neurons. You give it images. You know what the output is. You get an error, and you just do gradient descent to update your model parameters. So you do this. We had lots of data. You churn it through, and then you start. You get some results like this. And overall, I think in this case, this was the first time we went through the whole loop of collecting data, getting it tagged by humans. So that's why we needed the humans, because if we need a human to tell us where the plastic is. You need the human to give examples so the model can learn. If you don't have examples, then again, there's also stuff you can do, but that's a whole different area of research at the moment. So for example, a problem, so while these algorithms will work very well if you have lots of labeled training data. So if you have lots of examples where people have drawn boxes around stuff, then these things can work pretty well. But that's a bottleneck. If you think about a child, say a child who's never seen a dog in her life, and you just have to point out to the child once, look, that's a dog, and you explain it to her, and then she'll easily be able to point out other dogs. Humans only need one or two or a handful of examples to kind of get the idea and pick up stuff. On the computer side, we're not there yet. But that's an area of very active research at the moment. We flushed the pipe with this. It worked in that all the mechanics worked. The accuracy is only 25%, so it's not great. And there's various reasons for that. But there are some, it is actually already picking up some interesting stuff. So even for a human, if you start looking at it, it's not obvious. This is nicely zoomed in. If you look carefully, you see, okay, yeah, it's different. But it's not obvious. Or you're looking at fishing twine amongst a bunch of seaweed, a bunch of sticks. this is actually a pretty hard problem. Yes, so the challenges here are really getting enough labels, getting enough examples for the model to learn from. Also, it's great that you need 15 people to kind of agree on a particular bounding box before you're accepted. But even then, there's going to be some exact disagreement, or people might label it differently, or is it really the right class, etc. There's some noise in the labels. Again, the models for this, you're talking about 50 million parameters. That's how many parameters the model has. You've got 2 million tags, which is great. I mean, but you still only got 2 million data points for a model that has 50 million parameters. So your model is going to overfit to some extent. The more data you can get, the more you can robustify a model. But the nice thing about it is we can easily get lots of data, and the Zooniverse thing is a great way to get more tags. And I think the 25% can definitely be improved upon by just being more smart about how you train the model and just churn the handle. So that's all I'm going to say on the machine learning side. I mean, I'm happy to go more detailed if people are interested. I will just add something else just about the work on the SLAM side. But that's not something I've been involved in. That was more Stefan's work. But just for people who are interested. So, of course, say we have a model that works well. So we got lots of images, we got lots of boxes, and then, okay, fine, we get some statistics over the images we created. Okay, there were 25,000 bottle tops, and there were 5,000 shampoo bottles or whatever. It would be nice as well, though, if you could know roughly what the distribution was of the litter on the beach. Now, okay, the drone is flying. The drone has GPS, so you'll have a rough idea of where that photograph was taken, and then within that photograph, a rough idea of where the actual litter was. And that may be enough, may not be. But one idea was to get more information about the exact location, and also what if you could get the volume of the litter? So maybe something like a tire might be worse than a small bottle cap. I don't know, but it might be interesting to know what kind of mass is actually washing up on the beaches. And so this you can do through using work from robotics, in particular bundled adjustment. So the high-level idea here is you have a drone. It's flying over the beach, and the drone is taking pictures. Every second or so, it's taking pictures. And you know how the drone is moving through space. You know how the drone is flying through GPS or through its inertial navigation system. So you know how the drone is moving through space, and you know where you take every picture roughly. Now there's going to be some overlap between the two pictures. And if in two pictures you can see the same thing, you can work out using some trigonometry where in 3D space that thing is. So if I have a picture of a tire here, and then I fly forward half a meter and I take another picture, that tire is going to appear in both pictures. And so I have I know how my camera moved. I know where my tire is in the first image. I know my tire is in the second image. And then you can kind of work out using geometry and using a model of the camera where that tire is in 3D space. And you can actually build a 3D model of that tire. And if you do that, then you know how big the tire is. So you can work out the volume. And so this is traditional photogrammetry. If you buy an off-the-shelf drone, and there's some apps and web services that will allow you to do that. You just fly up and down, and you'll get like this 3D model. And that's, for example, what we did. So this is a still screenshot where you can kind of rotate and zoom this around. So this is taking all the images of the beach, stitching them together. You run this bundle adjustment, so you do the maths to figure out what the 3D surface topography looks like. And then you get this 3D model, and then you can take the bounding box that a human was drawn, and then you can kind of reproject it in your 3D model, and you know roughly where it is, and then you could do some post-processing to figure out what the actual model is. So it's not core. I guess the most important part is getting the stuff identified in the first place, but this is interesting from a research point of view, and also if you want to get more detailed information about how much mass is actually washing up. Cool. So, I think I'll leave it at that. So, overall, actually, this is a fairly well understood computer vision problem. You've got algorithms that work well. There's lots and lots of unlabeled data. That's still an area of active research, though. How do you deal with using more and more unlabeled data instead of requiring humans? But already, it's really good we have Zooniverse tags, because it was really useful. The 3D model can be useful. We haven't really gone, exploited that to its fullest extent. Challenges are, even for a human, it's not obvious to draw that bounding box, and the fact that you need 15 people to agree means it's not obvious for a human, which means it's definitely not going to be obvious for a computer. Also, you only pick up things which stand out. If something looks very similar to a pebble, you're not going to see it. So there's ideas around, can you use different parts of the spectrum to pick up different types of plastic and do stuff there. There is some label noise. Anyway, lots of ideas. But the key thing is, as Ellie said, it's all open source. All of this is published stuff. The algorithms there are well understood. The data sets are there. It's kind of just trying to make it easier to use and kind of make that automatic pipeline flow more smoothly. But then the outcome would be ideally that anybody can go to a beach, collect some imagery, upload it, and it just gets pushed through this model. And the next day you see there's a nice little dashboard or Google Map type interface where you can just see the hotspots and, this is how much plastic washed up on this beach or that beach. Very useful from a scientific point of view, but also interesting in terms of raising awareness and naming and shaming companies, etc. Cool. Thank you. Thanks.
Super conscious of time, so I'll very quickly just go through what the second phase is of what we want to do tomorrow. And thanks Dirk for that. It was awesome. So we've got the prototype. We want to bring it up to production level. We think about 80%, up to 80%, just because now we've got 1 million more tags than we did on our first prototype. So we did that with 500,000 tags. We've now got nearly 2 million. The global database and map we want to put up, everything's open source. We are very interested in extending the algorithm. We've started conversations about looking at it detecting on the sea floor and on the sea surface and in rivers, as well as potentially the water column. So those are avenues of research that we're looking at. We're looking to gamify it a bit more for citizen science as well. How can we make it more engaging and get more accurate tags out of it? How can we score people on it and that sort of stuff? And then finally, we've set up a drone network, a global drone network, where it's the first of the kind, I think. I'm pretty sure it's the first of the kind, where we look at the survey method and how we actually do it and how we sort of combat some of the challenges that Ellie identified earlier. And I think, and that's it. So just follow us. We're on social media. Get tagging. And thank you very much.
Brilliant.